This webinar explores the problem of translation and the ways in which a translation can help us to rethink the texts of antiquity. One of the things I've been working on at the moment is the place of desire, affection, and perhaps even love in the Iliad, and how those things collide with our ideas of social hierarchy and Homeric society in the relationship between Achilles and Briseis. So today I want to use that relationship as a case study for how we might think about affection in the Iliad and in the history of its reading. I thought we might come at that question through two divergent responses to the Iliad. Emily Wilson's powerful 2023 translation and a range of modern rewritings of epic, such as Madeline Miller, Emily Hauser, and Judith Starkston. In these texts, the well-known problem of understanding what Homeric characters want collides with the difficulty of narrating and reading desire. Could there be a relationship between Achilles and Briseis, and how should we translate it? Wilson's version, as we're going to see, gives one compelling answer to that question by almost completely effacing desire and the language of affection and marriage from the poem, or at least when it comes to Achilles and Briseis. There are good reasons for doing so, but Wilson's translation also stages a dialogue with a number of recent rewritings of the Iliad that have experimented with desiring female subjects. I think probably a lot of these will be familiar to many in the audience. What this webinar explores then is how a particular translation of the Iliad can be telling for how we read the poem. Translations and rewritings are interventions in wider cultural movements and in the history of reading epic. So I think that these responses are worth thinking about and thinking with because they offer strong ways of reading Homer that are themselves challenging responses to the epics. They take positions on things like subjectivity, affection, and desire. Their visions and revisions of the Iliad foreground the problems of reading and translating desire, particularly in Homer, where, as many of you will remember from your time in Cambridge, we don't have access to the thoughts of characters. There's no internal monologue, there's no lyric eye, all of that kind of thing. All translations and rewritings change their texts in particular ways and at the same time work to conceal that act of change often. But let me stress that what I'm not interested in today is whether these translations or rewritings are right or wrong, but rather in the way that their readings of Homer ask us to rethink our own understanding of epic in an ongoing process of reception. And that's what I want to look at today. How might Achilles and Briseis feel about each other? And how has that question been answered differently over the last 100 years or so of Homeric scholarship? So I thought in the next half an hour, 40 minutes or so, we could go through the Iliadic passages that I've been reading and rereading in these terms, as well as some of that history of their interpretation. Now, I think probably everything we're going to see will be familiar to everybody. We're looking at the Iliad and a number of famous responses to it. But what I want to do is first explore the ways in which Wilson refuses or effaces desire and the language of marriage between Achilles and Briseis, and consider how that might reflect or reject the desiring Briseises of many recent novels. And second, I want to use that problem of translating affection to reflect more widely on the protocols of desire and marriage in the Homeric text and the ways that they can upset logics of heroic behavior. And we'll come back to that. The decisions that we encounter in translation and in reception can, I think, encourage us to reread an old text again in new ways. Okay, so that's the preamble. Let's jump in. The key text for us today is Briseis's lament in Iliad 19. This is after the death of Patroclus and the recovery of his body. And you will remember You will remember that this comes, so Briseis is returned to Achilles to his shelter, and on her return, she finds the body of Patroclus, who's just been recovered. So I'll read the passage first. The woman, that's Briseis, looking like a goddess, wept and said, Patroclus, in my desperate plight, I loved you the most. I left you here alive, and I come back here now to find you dead after you led the troops to war. For me, one trouble always follows on another. I saw the man to whom my parents gave me cut down before our city with sharp bronze, along with my three brothers whom I loved. All of us shared one father and one mother, all of them slaughtered on a single day. But you, when swift Achilles killed my husband and sacked the city of divine King Munes, you would not let me weep at all. You said that you would make me the lawful wife of godlike Achilles, and that you would take me back to Thea on his ship, and there, among the Myrmidons, arrange a wedding feast to celebrate my marriage. And what we're going to be concerned with today is that phrase, Kuridien alochon, lawful wife of Achilles. The complexities of marriage and female status in these lines, and in Briseis's lament more widely, are a well-known interpretive crux. There's something Homeric scholars have been arguing about for a long time. Is Briseis telling the truth? Can she marry Achilles? Is a marriage between a prize, in quotation marks, and a hero allowed? Could Achilles really feel for Briseis? And did Patroclus really say that? And if he did he mean it? A long history of reading has refused the implications of Briseis's claim here and tried to foreclose any effort to read these lines for affection. So, for example, ancient commentators, ancient readers of Homer, assure us that Patroclus's promise of marriage is kind, it's very generous, but it's mere rhetoric designed to console or comfort Briseis. The Byzantine Archbishop Eustathius, to this day the only Homeric scholar to have achieved sainthood, records that some ancient readers criticized that phrase, kuridien alochon, legitimate wife, because the term is not proper, is not fitting for a woman who's already been married and is now perhaps, if we believe this, going to move to another husband. Now, this insistence on consolation rather than affection is, as I've said, the legacy of ancient scholars in Alexandria, who systematically reject any suggestion of erotic or romantic desire on Achilles' part. Their attempts to refuse any sense of marriage here set the terms for our understanding of the relation between Achilles and Briseis. So, a couple of examples for you. Um, at the end of the 19th century, Walter Leaf, a very well-known Homeric commentator, judged that the idea of a marriage between Achilles and a captive is alien not only to the rest of the Iliad, but to all the manners of the Homeric age. And I think the Victorian language of manners is very telling there. But it's not just Leaf. More recently, Mark Edwards, in his Cambridge commentary, claimed that the question whether Achilles could properly marry a widow will never arise except in the minds of commentators. So I'm a commentator that rules out my understanding, my reading. But I think the question should arise. To ignore it is to ignore the overlapping forms and tensions that define Briseis's position in the poem, and so to miss the complexities by which her status is constructed and problematized. If we attend to the language of this passage, there are reasons to take what Briseis says seriously. So here are two of those reasons. The first is that the adjective kuridios, lawful or wedded, appears elsewhere in Homer in the context of legitimate wives. So Clytemnestra in Iliad 1, Helen in Iliad 7 and 13, Anticlea in the Odyssey, and so on. Now, obviously, Helen and Clytemnestra are not ideal models of the Homeric wife, but what they are formal and legitimate wives, and that language is being shared here with Briseis. The second reason we might think carefully about what she says is the transference of that epithet theos, godlike, from Munes to Achilles. So you can see in the lines in gold, we go from Theoio Munetos to Achilleos Theoio. Ancient scholars again tell us that according to some traditions, Munes was Briseis's first husband. And their shared epithet here links the two men, or we might say replaces one lost husband with another potential one. Now, why Briseis transfers this epithet from Munes to Achilles might be psychologized in various ways as a traumatic compulsion to repetition, for example, rather than an expression of desire. But this overlaying in the text and or in the mind of Briseis encourages us to think in terms of male substitutability and to entertain the possibility that Achilles might replace Munes not only in the language of the text. But notice, to go back to Wilson's translation, how it refuses both of these readings by translating away that shared epithet, theoio. You wouldn't know from the English that there is a relation here between the two men. So you can see again in gold, we've got divine King Munes and godlike Lord Achilles. The overlap, whether it's happening in the text or in the mind of Briseis, is moved away. And I think this is in line with Wilson's stated aim in her introduction, where she says that what her translation does is reduce any suggestion of romantic connection. So Wilson says, the love of men for women has little place in the world of the Greek encampment. Agamemnon and Achilles quarrel over women, that's Briseis and Chryseis, and the Trojan War resulted from the rivalry of Paris and Menelaus over another woman, that's Helen. But the female trophies seized in war are desirable as markers of status, not because of any romantic connection. And yet, elsewhere in the Iliad, the language of affection and marriage clusters around Achilles and Briseis in ways that might suggest just such a romantic connection. So in Iliad 9, during his response to the embassy, Achilles claims that Briseis is the wife fitting his heart, his allochon thumareia. I'll read the passage again. So Achilles says, the other Achaeans still have their prizes, but he, Agamemnon, took mine from me, not anybody else's. He has my own woman, my own heart's desire. Well, let him lie with her, let him enjoy her. Why should the Greeks make war against the Trojans? Why did he gather troops and bring us here? Was it not to retrieve a woman, Helen? Are they the only men who love their women, those sons of Atreus? All fine good men love their own woman and take care of them, just as I loved that woman, Briseis, from my heart, with my heart, even though she was a captive of my spear. And notice here again how Wilson's version offers a particular take on the rhetoric, if that's what it is, of this passage and its language of wives. So what Wilson does is take advantage of the fact that the term alochos, wife, can mean either wife or a woman who shares a man's bed. In Wilson's version, Briseis is simply a woman. And that produces some of the oddity that you'll have noticed in the comparison that Achilles is trying to make between Briseis, Helen, and the other wives or women of the Achaeans. Here, marriage turns into a question of possession. Now, there are, of course, other ways that we could understand this passage. Here is another of my favorite translations of the Iliad. This is Caroline Alexander's 2015 version. What Alexander does is keep that language of wives and brides. So I'll read it again. Here in Alexander's version, Achilles says, other prizes of honor he doled out to the noble men and to the kings. Theirs remain unplundered. Mine alone of the Achaeans he took away, and he holds the bride fitted to my heart. Let him lie with her and take his pleasure. But why must the Argives be at war with the Trojans? Why did the sons of Atreus assemble and lead an army here? Was it not for Helen of the lovely hair? Do the sons of Atreus alone of mortal men love their wives? No, for any man who is decent and wise loves her who is his own and cares for her, as I too love this one from my heart, spear one though she be. If we put these two versions together, you can see the different ways of translating the relation that Achilles claims between himself and Briseis. So on the left, that's Wilson's version, who renders wife or bedmate alochos as woman, and you see the language of woman running through that passage. On the right, you have Alexander, who doubles down on the sense of bride and wife. Now, the reason this interpretive move is particularly interesting, I think, is that that phrase, alochon thumarea, appears only once more in Homer, and that's in Odyssey 23 for Odysseus and Penelope. So this at the final moment when they recognize each other and fall into each other's arms, Odysseus then holds his alochon thumarea, his love, his faithful wife. Now, of course, there's more reason to translate it this way for Odysseus and Penelope, and there's a nice irony to have Achilles in Iliad 9 use the language of Odysseus and Penelope when he's talking to Odysseus. Um, but what I think Wilson's version is doing is challenging us to problematize that claim for marriage and for affection between Achilles and Briseis. Why? To what effect? I think there are broadly two answers, or at least two I want to explore here to that question. The first is that Wilson's translating away of the term alochos, wife, and effacing of marriage has excellent scholarly pedigree. This is a well-known move in scholarship. Um, Brian Hainsworth, in his Cambridge commentary, saw what Achilles says as a rhetorical move designed to equate Briseis with the other wives of the Achaeans, in particular Helen. So, what Hainsworth says is it's a pity that he, that's Achilles, should make this declaration, emphatic though it is, only in a context where his rhetoric requires Briseis to be raised to the status of the wives of the Atreidae, so that his loss can be equated with Menelaus. And you can see the point of that. Achilles is what Achilles is saying is that all the Achaeans are there at Troy because Paris stole Helen, because one man stole another man's wife. But isn't that, says Achilles, what Agamemnon has done to him? Seeing this as rhetoric would also remove any suggestion that Achilles means what he says here, and that what Briseis says in Iliad 19 could be a reality. As Jasper Griffin, who taught Emily Wilson in Oxford at Balliol, once famously said, Achilles is not to be thought of as a romantic lover. The second reason I think Wilson's translation does this is that her translation is designed, its politics are designed in explicitly feminist terms to bring out the cruelties and the violence of the male Iliadic world. This is, of course, a strong way of reading the poem, but it allows Wilson to speak to the desiring female subjects that have populated many recent rewritings of the Iliad. And I want to go through some of these quickly to show you what I mean. So, spoiler warning, I'm going to try to avoid any major spoilers for these novels. They're all about Troy, so mostly you know how the plot will go, but each does something slightly different with the end of the Trojan War. All of these novels know the Iliad very well, and what they do is experiment with a desiring Briseis and her relation to Achilles, and explore the various love triangles that can be generated between her, Achilles, and Patroclus. So, my first example is probably familiar to everyone, I imagine. This is Madeline Miller's well-known Song of Achilles. Told from the perspective of Patroclus, this version mainly explores the relationship between Achilles and him and the narrator. But it also focuses on the sibling relation that emerges between Patroclus and Briseis. And within that, there's a space for Briseis and for what she wants. In this passage that you've got on the slide, Um, the two have gone into the forest in search of herbs for medicine. They sit together, they talk for a while, and Briseis kisses Patroclus. So I'll read that first bit. Um, Her lips touched mine. I was so surprised I did not move. Her mouth was soft and a little hesitant. Her eyes were sweetly closed. Of habit, of its own accord, my mouth parted. So after this, Patroclus kind of moves away, and it becomes clear to Briseis that this relationship is impossible, that there's no hope of them ever fully having a relationship. And she says in response, I know that you love him, she said, hesitating a little before each word. I know, but I thought that some men have wives and lovers both. Her face looked very small and so sad I could not be silent. Briseis, I said, if I ever wished to take a wife, it would be you. So this relationship is never going to come to fruition because the book is about and focused on Patroclus's relation with Achilles. But it's one of the first kinds of response to the Iliad, the first rewritings, to feature a desiring Briseis who might be able to choose for herself. And that focus on Briseis continues in my second example. This is Emily Hauser's For the Most Beautiful. Here, as those of you who've read it will know, the story is primarily told in the first person by Chryseis, whom you'll remember from Iliad 1 as Agamemnon's prize, and also by Briseis. In Hauser's version, Briseis has been happy with her first husband, that's King Munes, whom we met earlier, and whom Achilles kills at the sacking of Lyrnessos. And that sets up an initial hatred for Achilles, one that slowly moves into desire as the novel progresses. As what we've got here is a dream sequence where the beginnings of that desire come almost subconsciously to Briseis. As she relates, I dreamt that night of Achilles. In my dream, I lay with him. I knew in the deepest, most secret parts of my flesh what it felt like to be kept awake by the unstoppable desire of a demigod. And then I've skipped a few lines because it gets quite spicy there. But as we come back in, all was a confusion of desire as he touched me. And I felt the brush of his lips upon mine, so real that it was almost. And here the narrating voice breaks off. That's Hauser's elision. Um, Obviously, we can all see where this is going, and indeed, Briseis's desire turns into a love that she can't quite speak but does acknowledge. So, a passage from slightly later on in the novel where Briseis finally starts to articulate her feelings for Achilles. Um, so again, I'm trying to avoid spoilers, but in her attempts to protect and look after him, Patroclus asks why she cares for Achilles. So as the narrating voice tells us, Patroclus stared at me for a few long moments. Why are you so eager to save Achilles after all he has done? He said at last. Why not let him die, if you're so certain that he will be killed, when he destroyed the people of Pedasus, your people? Have you ever been in love, Patroclus? That's Briseis. His eyes dropped to the ground, swiftly, so I could not catch their expression. Yes, he said, his voice even. Then you know that if you lost the one you loved, if you saw them killed before your eyes, then there's nothing you would not do to prevent it happening again. And here, as in Iliad 19, Briseis begins talking about King Munes, her first husband, and then slides into talking about Achilles. This attempt to construct or rewrite a relation of affection and even love between Achilles and Briseis finds one of its most powerful articulations in Judith Starkston's 2014 Hand of Fire. In this version, Briseis hates her first husband, King Munes, and is constantly troubled by visions of a beautiful demigod who, in minor spoilers but obvious, turns out to be Achilles. Starkston is explicit about this in her author notes at the end of the book, where she reflects on what her version is doing. She says, we learn very little about Briseis. She has a handful of lines in this patriarchal poem. In my interpretation of Homer, it seems clear that Achilles loves and respects her, and she returns these feelings. This rewriting of the Trojan War does two fascinating things with its Iliadic material. The first is that Achilles doesn't treat Briseis as a prize at all. She's captured with the sack of the city, but at that moment she tries to attack Achilles with a sword in defense of her brother, which wins his admiration and desire. And their relationship from the start is configured as one of love rather than one of ownership. And in a very telling moment, when they return to Troy, and Achilles is picking his prizes for the sack of the city, he doesn't pick Briseis. He leaves her out of the distribution of spoils and takes her instead by the hand later. The second thing this does is when we get to the Iliadic sections of the narrative, the novel quotes the Iliad almost verbatim on a number of occasions. So, particularly when Achilles' horse Xanthos prophesies his death in Iliad 19, that's quoted, and the meeting between Achilles and Priam is almost word for word. But one of those quotations in particular captures how Starkston's novel goes all in on love, affection, and even marriage. This is, here you go. So Patroclus says to Briseis, Achilles has never treated you as a slave. From the moment you defended your brother with a sword, you've held a place in Achilles' heart. On the day that he found you, Achilles swore an oath that he would make you his wedded wife, Couridien alochon. I think this is a direct quotation of what Briseis says in Iliad 19 and an attempt to retrofit the fact that she said Patroclus told her this. If you're willing, when this hateful war ends, Achilles will take you back to Tyre, to his father's palace. Here is my bride, my lawful wife, Achilles will say that language again, and Peleus will welcome you. So, what all of these rewritings or responses to the Iliad do, to a greater or lesser extent, is explore the place of desire and even love in the epic world. Together, Wilson's translation and the versions of Miller, Hauser, and Starkston offer two competing models for the relationship between those two, between Achilles and Briseis. It seems to me that what they're doing is picking up on the ways in which the Iliad itself keeps that possibility open, but always open to contestation. So, what I want to do for the rest of our time is turn back to the Iliad now and look more closely at what might be hints of affection between Achilles and Briseis. And I say what might be, I should stress is very much what I think. My students often disagree with me. Given Achilles' insistence in Iliad 9 on the ethical force of language, he says that it should create and match reality. I think there's good reason to at least take what he says seriously. So those of you who remember Iliad 9 will know Achilles says, I hate like the gates of Hades, the man who says one thing and thinks another. That's a big problem for him. So given that, I think we should stick with his language, stick with allochon thumereia, and see what happens if we take it seriously, if we follow him in his attempt to match it to the world and allow it to sound possibilities of marriage. So we get two more moments in the text of the Iliad that invites such a reading. And those of you who know the poem are probably thinking of these already. The first is at the beginning of the quarrel with Agamemnon, Achilles' characterization of his prize as something dear to him, philos. Um, as you can see here, Achilles says, my hands work hardest in the frenzied fighting. But when we share the spoils, you, Agamemnon, get much more. I come back to the ships worn out from battle with something valuable to me, but small. Olegon te philon te. As many of you will also remember from your time in Cambridge, the adjective philos is very difficult to translate in Homer. Does it have a purely possessive, weak sense, mine, something belonging to me, or does it mean something more affectionate, dear, dear to me? Uh, Many scholars, Benveniste, Hooker, Robinson, and others, have made a collective case that philos always has some affective dimension. And if we buy that, we might see some kind of affectionate comment on Briseis here. I get something that's dear to me. And yet notice how for Wilson, this is simply possessive, something valuable. Or value, as everyone will know, is different to affection. What this Wilson's translation situates this in a sphere of economic value, the prize, what it's worth, rather than in one of desire. My second moment that we might want to read is a little bit later in Iliad 1. This is the glimpse of Briseis's subjectivity after Patroclus leads her out and gives her to the heralds of Agamemnon to be taken away. And Seth Shine has pointed out in his commentary that this scene deploys the scripts of the marriage ceremony. So a woman is taken out of the house and given to others to be taken away. As this happens, Briseis walks unwillingly, aekusa, alongside them. So I'll read it again. Patroclus did as his dear friend had asked, and brought fresh-faced Briseis from the tent and gave her to the men to take away. They started walking back beside the ships. The woman walked unwillingly beside them. Meanwhile, Achilles went to sit alone, away from his comrades, and he wept beside the salt grey water, looking out across the endless sea. What does that mean? Unwillingly, aekusa. How much pressure should we put on that word, and how much should we read into it? I've given you two diametrically opposed responses to the passage. The first is Wilson, who, as you've noticed, translates literally, but then in her introduction, forecloses a positive reading here. Says, there's only one word, unwillingly, to describe the reluctance of Briseis to leave the tent of Achilles to be taken to Agamemnon, moving from one enslaving rapist to another. By contrast, Rachel Lesser, in a recent book about desire in or desire and the Iliad, sees this as an indication of subjectivity. So she says this is the first indication in the narrative that the female object can also be subject of her own desires. What you make of these passages depends on what you think the place of affection might be in the Iliad. One thing I haven't yet decided myself, but I think is important, is that the last time we see Achilles in the Iliad is this moment, where he's asleep inside his well-built hut, and beside him lay beautiful Briseis. One way of crystallizing the uncertainties of reading here is the translation of the term gune in some of the passages we've already seen. So I've given you some examples. Gune, and again, many of you will remember this, is a classic example of the interpretive problems of translation. How do we decide between the senses gune, woman, and gune, wife? In the Iliad, Briseis is called a Gune at precisely those moments where the question of her relationship to Achilles is most at stake. So under number one, when she unwillingly leaves his shelter, under number two, when Achilles is digesting her loss, and under number three, when she mourns Patroclus in the scene that we began with from Iliad 19. That indeterminacy between woman and wife is famously exploited in Odyssey 19, where both the disguised Odysseus and the narrating voice repeatedly refer to Penelope with forms of gune in ways that allow the truth of their marriage to peek out from beneath the beggar's verbal and physical disguises. I think in the case of Briseis too, the Iliad is posing the question of how she is to be understood, which is to say what kind of Gune we think she is, and whether she could be translated from the subject position of woman to that of wife. The reason I think it matters that we recognize this repeated language of affection and marriage around Achilles and Briseis is that its suggestion of emotional attachment works against and unsettles the logic of equivalence that is often thought to drive the male heroic world. Much of the normative world of the Iliad is built on the exchangeability of things, the exchangeability of women. Think, for example, of the metrically and formulaically equivalent Chryseis and Briseis, and Agamemnon's attempt to replace or substitute one or the other. But what Achilles does is introduce affection into the logic of that system in a way that ruptures it. How can exchange work when things are valued differently? That's what Ajax, Aias the Greater, fails to understand in Iliad 9. As I'm sure many of you will remember, in the embassy to Achilles, Agamemnon offers him endless gifts if he will come back, if he will return to protect the Achaeans. Achilles says no, and at the end of the book, Aias says, well, Achilles is being unreasonable. He's angry about one woman, but we've just offered him six, and they're from Lesbos. What Ajax doesn't get is that yes, six is more than one, but Achilles likes, or perhaps loves, Briseis. Affection, desire, and love upset social hierarchies predicated on exchangeability by introducing other standards of value. Now, to kind of draw this together, I don't think we can decide whether Achilles and Briseis mean the desires that I at least hope they express, or whether they could really get married. But the language of the poem at least opens that possibility, which works against some of the epic's other drives towards exchangeable material gain. That's how Achilles radically questions the social order. I think the reason it's worth reading for affection is that this is another way in which the Iliad puts at stake value systems and shows how they unsettle each other. Material gain, love, grief after the death of Patroclus are all reasons for action that cannot quite be reconciled. The question the Iliad asks us always is, what is something worth? What is your life worth? The one thing of value that you have. And Achilles is going to say in Iliad 9, life cannot be exchanged. So the reason I like to think about the relationship between Briseis and Achilles is that it raises these questions of affection in a way that helps me to reflect on the problem of value in the Iliad. But it also refuses any simple answer. And that has been the point today of approaching this question through the challenges posed by Wilson's translation and the rewritings of Miller, Hauser, and Starkston. There are many ways in which this poem can be read, and desire is always resistant to narrative. Even when it's spoken, it remains veiled. What makes the Iliad always more is the possibility for new readings, new translations and responses that lurk within the untranslatability of its desires. And I'll stop there. Thank you.